Welcome to my Hack Motion webinar presentation for the PGA Show 2023. And we're going to keep it relatively straightforward, I hope, because it's pretty easy to get quite tangled up in this kind of data and you can get yourself into a little bit of a mess, especially when we're starting to look at the actions of both wrists. So we're going to run through some data on some different shots that I hit and also an example of a player who struggles, just to identify the differences between the good and the not so good. But to begin with, we'll start to look at the interactions between both wrists and maybe how things aren't quite as you'd expect them to be. So obviously this is me. This is quite recent. You can see I've got a sensor on both wrists and we're able to capture the shot of both wrists at the same time and the video to correlate with the data. And we kind of got a few hurdles to get over in that maybe things aren't quite what you think, as in that the wrists never really work as a mirror image of one another. You would need a hold on the club that would allow that, which would be as near as we can get to palms completely facing. But even when you go to there, the build of the club with one hand being below the other means that certain angles are never going to be the same. They're never going to interact in a mirrored kind of manner. So as an example, one wrist can be doing the total opposite of the other wrist. And looking at this slide, if you just look at the data on the right there, I'll hit play on the video so you can see the shot itself. I'll run through in slow motion also. If we just look at flexion extension of the lead wrist, which is the top data set, and the trail wrist, which is the bottom data set, you can see that from the top of the swing, the trail wrist actually extends more, while the lead wrist also extends more. So if we use the target orientation for this, you would say that the trail wrist is extending almost away from target, while the lead wrist extends towards target. Now, how can that be? Well, the hands are turned in towards one another for a start. So these extensions and deviations start to affect the other angles in the wrist quite significantly. Okay, so we need to almost remove from our minds that because one wrist is doing one thing, we can assume that the other wrist is doing another. Now, this is a rabbit hole that we could go way, way down, and we could start to look at, well, if I extend my trail wrist with a certain kind of grip, with a trail hand that's 0, lead hand that's turned 45 degrees, etc., what would change as far as deviation goes and rotation? We could go down that rabbit hole, but we haven't got all day to try and do that. So we will just get it across that wrist interactions are linked, but the relationships can vary wildly. Really dependent on how the hold is on the golf club and how the hands are oriented towards one another. And then there's the assumption that the hands even stay in the same place on the grip throughout the shot, which, as we know, a lot of players do not keep their hands in the same place on the club, hence worn out gloves with your average player. And then you can see some tour players who literally let go of the golf club at certain points in the swing, which is going to throw everything off. But anyway, that's a story for another day. So what I want to do is just have a look at a couple of areas and identify a couple of points that I see commonly amongst good players to start with. Okay, the first one is going to be deviation stability. Okay, the deviation, we've got the second row of numbers. It's in kind of the dark blue. You can see lead wrist starts at 35 degrees on the deviation, moves to 12 at the top, minus 12, and then back to minus 35. So lead wrist deviation from address to impact hits right on the money. Okay, trail wrist 47, minus 19, 50, 3-degree change, not that significant and pretty close for a trail wrist. Lead is always a little bit easier. It's bang on the same number. Trail just a little bit more tricky. Again, for reasons that we don't really need to talk about, just knowing that the stability is there. Now, why is deviation stability important? Well, for me, it's the primary control over the size of the circle you swing on, or the radius of the circle you swing on, whatever you want to call it. Where is the center of that circle? Well, it moves all over the place. But I figured that if you're going to try and get control over the circle, the attachment to the club is a pretty good place to start. Obviously, you can move the body around, you can flex the elbows, all these kind of things also changes the size and location of the circle. That's fine. But let's look at the real connection we have with the golf club and look at that for the starting point for control. So deviation control for me is big. I see amongst good players along different kinds of shots, different patterns, that is pretty much a constant. Trail wrist stability. Okay, so what you'll see here is that the trail wrist starts at address plus 18, goes to 33, so it's extending on the backswing, and then it extends a little bit more down into impact. So what it is not doing is moving from extended towards flexed. Okay, so there is an element of holding in that trail wrist or stability. But if you take a look at the video, you'll see that the shaft still lines up pretty damn quickly. All right, it's not like it's held and driven towards the target. The lesson to be learned here is that you can hold a stable trail wrist, still release the club shaft out. Now, how well there's a rotation element to it, as in from the shoulder joint down to the hand. The body will do a little bit, but there's also that little bit of extension or moving towards it, more extension in the lead wrist. Okay, so there's other stuff going on. The common assumption would be that releasing the shaft or releasing the club head, whatever you want to call it, is all about trail wrist. It's not. I look for stability there. In fact, if you want to have a little bit of research into the very worst chippers and the peer-reviewed literature that's out there, typically players that identify themselves with the yips, because it is a self-identification process, unfortunately, there's a commonality amongst them that it is a trail side issue. It's a trail side issue, okay? So I wouldn't be surprised if you get somebody on hack on the trail wrist to see some pretty funky stuff on there, but we will go a little bit further into that in a moment. So let's have a look at rotational speeds, which will be the final point I'm going to make on this slide, is that we can see a consistency in speed between left, center, and right. As in the degrees per second at 449 and 464, pretty tightly related to one another. We're not seeing a big discrepancy or difference between those two measures. Okay, so that lets me know that things are working at a pretty good rate. Nothing is overtaking particularly quickly. There's no real last minute adjustments or panic mode buttons being pressed. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is a slightly different pattern in that you will see, I'll just run the video again, a little bit different. You'll see the release is a little bit different, but if we go to key points again, deviation is pretty much bang on again, 0 degree change, address to impact for the left wrist, and a couple for the trail. You can see quite a decent sized increase from address to impact with trail wrist extension. Again, increasing, not decreasing. Lead wrist, decent amount of change going back from address to top and then moving back towards address at the impact point. Okay, so we're seeing some common traits here. Okay, speeds 595, 503. Pretty close once again. Okay, so two quite different release patterns. If you do watch them back, you'll see how different they are. Pretty different flights, certainly two different styles of play. And then just for fun, we'll throw in a high shot. So you see much higher rotational numbers, but obviously it's a bigger swing, there's more speed required. Again, if you look at the lead side, deviation on the money for the third time. Deviation in the trail wrist, however, quite different. Okay, like a 14 degree change. So really the trail wrist is uncocking pretty fast while the lead wrist doesn't uncock fast. So you think back 10 minutes and what I said about the wrist not behaving in a mirrored fashion. Okay, not unusual to see the trail wrist uncocking this quick with a high shot. If the lead wrist is uncocking to that degree, now we might have a few contact issues. But because of the orientation of the hand on the club and how the club is being delivered, that trail wrist uncocking fast helps to release the club out quick and add loft to it without losing control of the sweet spot. But let's have a quick scan on a low one. This is going to be the last one of these. You're going to see, again, a little bit different. Lead wrist still moving back towards address extension, deviation pretty close on both, couple of degrees change. Rotational speeds, the lowest out of the lot. Obviously transfers the most energy to the golf ball. Trail wrist stability is there. Top of the swing to impact is identical. Quite a big amount of trail wrist extension. But you can see the setup changes, right? So there's more to begin with. Then it increases throughout the backswing and stays the same down to the golf ball. Okay, so despite these being a couple of different release patterns and different trajectories, essentially the wrists are doing very, very similar things, except for the high shot where the trail wrist would uncock or go into ulnar deviation, or further into ulnar deviation a little bit more than the other shots because of the addition of loft through impact. Okay, and just for your reference, here are three of the trajectories. So we've got a low, a baseline, and a high. The baseline is the first thing that I showed you, just so you can take your time and peruse through it at your leisure. But now we're going to get into the fun stuff. So we're going to have a look at a player who, by their own admission, does not really like to chip at all. Now, this guy standing in front of you on your lesson tee, you're probably going to look at his setup. But for the purpose of this, I was interested in what his wrists were doing. So it's like, right, get over there, let's measure you, let's see what's going on. And we're going to start to identify what pattern we're seeing here, then compare it to the baseline pattern that I showed you in the original slide, original swing, and just see how different they are. Now, what you're going to see is much flatter lines overall, especially for the deviation, flexion, extension, and then the shots you've already seen. So that's because this player is attempting to hold the wrists as firmly as they can pretty much throughout the stroke. Okay, so lead wrist not moving back towards extension. Okay, not that surprising. Trail wrist starting flex, this is unusual, by the way. See, it's more the build of the hands in the player. So the right hand had to kind of go on in a flex position, extends a little bit going back, but then it actually goes beyond its original flex at impact. Okay, so that right hand is really working underneath the collar a lot. Deviation control, not so good either. I'm probably jumping ahead. Let's just see which order it was in. Doesn't have to attempt to hold lead wrist stable. We've got that. No significant moves towards extension. Yeah, we said that. Let's just rewind a little bit and go to the under-rotated lead side. Okay, so despite the rotational speed being off the charts crazy high, the lead forearm or lead sensor is not rotating back to its original position. Okay, let's make a note of that. The trail wrist is flexed beyond address, or extended. No, flexed beyond address, sorry, yeah, we covered that already, just going in circles slightly, apologies. It's so unusual that I just caught myself out. Trail side is over-rotated. So if under-rotated lead, over-rotated trail. Massive rotational speed issue. Just off the charts. Crazy high. Okay, so as a pattern, lead wrist stability is looking for not attempting to move towards extension of the lead. Lead wrist or center is under-rotated. Trail wrist is flexed beyond address, which is really quite unusual. Trail center is over-rotated and he has a massive rotational speed issue. So that's a nice little shopping list of things we can identify there. Let's just revisit the first shot and have a look at the same things for a comparison. Okay, lead wrist extending towards address levels of extension, right? There's not an attempt to hold the lead wrist. It is moving into more extension than it was at the top of the swing. The lead is more rotated than address. Okay, not unusual there amongst some players. Trail wrist extended beyond address. So this is definitely not more flex than it was at address. It is in fact more extended, which would be the polar opposite. Under rotated trail side, not enormously. Okay, you can see they're not a million miles away from each other, but we're going to be picky and say it's under. And rotational speeds are very close. Now, so how does that compare to the guy we just saw? Let's just build those out. So as I go, we can compare apples to apples and look at the lead wrist. Well, there's an attempt to hold it. More rotated, under rotated, trail wrists totally opposite. Rotation on the trail side, over, under, opposite. Rotational speed is very close, rotational speed issue, and a big lack of deviation control. All right, if you just think back again, I'm looking for good deviation control, and if I see that that's off, I'm probably going to try and address that best I can. But the addressing of that really is going to come from better moves elsewhere. It's a very, very tricky thing to ask somebody to focus or attempt to improve their control of the deviation of the wrist throughout the swing, because the orientation of them is moving so fast. It's not like your hands are just right in front of you. You can think, right, I'm going to keep my thumbs down, or I'm going to move my thumbs up towards the sky. The orientation relative to you is changing rapidly. Okay, so when I do see a lack of deviation control, I'm probably going to look elsewhere for it. As this player is an example, I'm not going to show the after. Not because it wasn't any good, but it's because I didn't record it. We did go in and just spend 5 or 10 minutes having a mess around. And by trying to move the player towards more of the pattern you can see on the left, less of an attempt to hold lead wrist stable. If you look at the graphs, you'll see that the video shows you as well. There is definitely a transition issue in that there's a pull across the club, and that changes the wrist angles quite a bit. Just the intent to be lead wrist focused, which he liked because that's how he explained he felt things. Having him feel like he actually loads the club or twists the club more on the way back. It doesn't attempt to go with the stability. If anything, lead wrist would go to more flexed on the way back and then move much more into extension on the way through. Had him placing a very different twist on the club. And that different twist on the club you'd expect, or I would expect, to provide stability elsewhere. Okay, so the thing is with this is you can look at the numbers and pick out the thing that doesn't really fit. But the way to correct that isn't always going to be to directly hit that number. Okay, as in I've actually looked at his flexion extension in order to provide some stability on his deviation. And also, for that matter, stability on his rotational speeds. Now, why are they so high? Well, he has to get the golf club on the ball somehow, and he's producing a twist on the golf club in a particular way, which I'm then asking him to replace by providing a twist or producing a torque around the grip by changing flexion extension. All right, so we're working in different planes of motion, but we're using one to influence the other. The reason I've not really dived into the hows and befores and afters is because this is just one little case study. And I think the most important thing is to recognize that there are certain patterns that I look for. There are certain stabilities I look for, certain consistencies. But you can't just apply it with a broad brushstroke across every golfer in front of you. There are always going to be exceptions to the rule. And furthermore to that, the response of a player towards the instruction is always going to vary wildly. So I can't say this is the fix for this issue if you see it. But just more of a knowledge and an awareness that changing one variable can influence the others pretty quickly. Right, so that's me done. Hopefully we're going to get some good questions. Let's step into that.